Welcome to this roundtable on the backlash to the international legal order, breakdown or breakthrough, as part of this year's 2021 American Society of International Law virtual annual meeting. I'm Peter Danchin, Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Research and Faculty at the University of Maryland School of Law, where I also direct the school's International Comparative Law program. I'm absolutely delighted this morning to welcome our four distinguished speakers, and I'll be introducing each of them in turn shortly. But first, a few words on the topic. The topic for this roundtable is arguably the most pressing, and I would say most perplexing, issues in the field of international law today. We're at a moment when the modern internationalist vision of multilateral cooperation and global governance is widely understood to be under assault and unraveling, and when ideas of supranational organization and post-national sovereignty are increasingly resisted. For the past 4 years in particular, we've witnessed America's almost complete abdication of its traditional leadership role in key international institutions and its commitment to both international legal norms and key treaty regimes. The causes of the current backlash are, of course, complex and multifaceted. But interestingly, international lawyers tend to tell a broadly familiar story. Following the disastrous consequences of the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the global financial crisis in 2008, and the attendant effects of years of neoconservative American foreign policy and neoliberal economic policy, it is said that a populist backlash has emerged that opposes not only global governance conceptions of international law, but also key pillars of the post-Second World War UN Charter-based liberal international legal order and its key norms of sovereign equality and collective security. For critical international legal theorists, these currents can be traced often to contradictions internal to the normative structure of international law itself, and in particular, the dramatic shift in understandings of sovereignty under conditions of technological globalization. But many are beginning to argue that these developments, in fact, may portend a deeper existential crisis of values that goes well beyond the mainstream academic tendency to explain the entirety of backlash phenomena solely in terms of economic factors and material well-being. So these are really the big themes and the big questions that we're going to address in our roundtable this morning. Are we in fact backsliding from a rules-based international order to a more lawless world, or is the international legal perhaps more resilient than that? Is there an existential crisis of values that's driving resentment in politics today against this order? And lastly, has this order perhaps even counterintuitively serve to incubate authoritarian populism and illiberal democracy in certain respects? So with these brief introductory remarks, let me turn now to our four panelists and ask them to offer their thoughts and diagnosis on the current backlash moment and where we are exactly in international law today. So let me turn first to Shruti Rana, who is Professor of International Law Practice and Director of the International Law and Institutions Program at the Hamilton Luger School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. Shruti was previously an Associate Professor at Maryland Law School and has worked at both the United Nations for the CEDAW Committee and in private practice. She's currently engaged with scholars at ANU in Australia and at Maryland with myself, and at Indiana on an international research project titled Navigating the Backlash Against Global Law and Institutions. So Shruti, how do you see the current picture in international law? And in particular, how do we understand or diagnose the causes and consequences of this current populist moment?
Well, thank you so much, Peter. I'm honored to be here, and I just want to take a moment to thank the American Society for International Law for putting together this panel and for the other panelists for joining us. So to pick up on what Peter has said, and to give you a little bit of an idea of how I interpreted his question, We find ourselves today poised really on on the edge of a moment of change. We're watching the traditional structures and institutions of the post-World War II global legal order wobble or fall around us. And international lawyers have been questioning whether this is just a cyclical downturn in the strength and utility of the international legal order, or whether we're instead witnessing a messy and painful collapse and possibly the bloody birth of a new order. So, to answer this question, I wanted to share some of the findings from the global project that Peter just mentioned, which focuses on analyzing the current backlash to the global legal order and how we might respond to and emerge from it. As he mentioned, my colleagues on this project include Peter, as well as 3 scholars from the Australian National University, Jeremy Farrell, Joe Ford, and Imogen Sanders. So I'd like to turn to the causes and consequences portion of the question. In this project, we've been evaluating the impact of the sustained and lasting challenges that populist regimes and movements are posing to the functioning of the global norms and institutions that support our international order. We see this backlash, or we see the key challenge really, to the international legal order as a populist backlash to the global liberal order itself. This is characterized by the simultaneous retreat of an array of national governments from longstanding commitments to international norms and institutions. It's predicated on a distrust of globalization and cosmopolitan elites. And its leaders elevate deep fears of losing traditional identities and power, and as a result have been focusing on strengthening national sovereignty as well as limiting national and international powers to the groups who are deemed authentic representations of a particular nation or people. So, what makes this different from other populist moments or waves that we've seen in the past, I think, is that the current backlash moment goes far beyond simply discontent or critique of globalizing forces, but actually is taking the form of fundamental resistance to and rejection of the underpinnings of the liberal legal order. The backlash movements have been targeting their ire on the post-Cold War vocabulary of globalization and transnational government, as well as the implicit critiques of national sovereignty that are internal to these discourses. So we see these primary targets as the specialized governance regimes rising in the 1990s, areas such as trade, human rights, environment, security, and migration. And in particular, they're attacking we've seen a proliferation of complex managerial vocabularies that speak not about sovereignty or rules, but really about values like inclusion and equality. So in response, we've seen a critical shift in the views of populist leaders at national levels. So what we as international lawyers might see as a pluralistic, cooperative, transnational order under an impartial global rule of law, they see as something quite different. It's viewed as a project of imperial world domination bent on reducing or neutering their power. So in other words, we're losing the consensus or whatever consensus we might have had around the idea that we will all be better off if a rising tide of globalization lifts all boats. Instead, what we're seeing is that the asymmetrical gains of globalization are leading to a battle of all against all, where a majority share of relative power within a smaller pie is seen as more valuable than a larger pie for all. This is more true if the larger pie comes with mechanisms for redistribution of wealth and power. So in this light, then, I think the question we're facing now is whether this backlash that we're witnessing is really more of a watershed moment. Will we see that the rejection of the ideals of globalization and the retreat into national borders, will it be strong enough to overwhelm and sweep away the underpinnings of our current liberal international order? So I want to move now, if we identify that as the cause, I want to move now to some of the consequences of these forces and consider the impact that the pandemic has had in particular. So what we're seeing now is that the contradictions that give rise to the current fragility of the international legal order are actually self-reinforcing, right? So the problems in the transnational legal order are compounding one another and are worsening spirals that are causing the fragility in the first place. So I'll start with some of these contradictions and paradoxes. The first, I think, most basic contradiction we're facing right now is the pandemic paradox, right? That's the idea that our system of global governance is unraveling at precisely the moment we need it the most, right? So the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the necessity of an effective legal order at the very time when these ideas of supranational organization and collaboration are most resisted. So this is driving two other contradictions that are again moving back into and reinforcing the spirals that are causing this fragility in the international legal order. The first of these reinforcing contradictions is that a focus on increasing national powers has actually led to a weakening of state power and a leadership vacuum. So one of the distinctive features of the COVID-19 pandemic has been the absence of effective global leadership to this escalating threat. Throughout the pandemic, we've seen international organizations, great powers. They've really distinguished themselves by their incapacity or unwillingness or failure to act, right? Failure to take the steps necessary to effectively and collectively respond to the pandemic, whether it's at the international level or the national level. We see this in the US, UK, Brazil, India, lots of different places. So instead of fighting the pandemic, the leaders in this nation instead turn inward, seeking to appeal to domestic political forces by scapegoating the international institutions that previously were so useful to their foreign policy agendas. So what this means is that disengagement from the international legal order becomes more pronounced just as the need for swift collective global action rises. In turn, the failures of cooperative multilateralism fuels increased skepticism of expert knowledge and global governance. So you see this spiral going around. This spiral on the international level is gathering force from parallel developments at the national level. We've called this the border paradox. That is, the very moves that populists claim will strengthen national sovereignty and power, right, which is strengthening national borders and reducing international engagement, are actually precisely the very same factors that render nations more vulnerable to shocks like the pandemic and also increase the fragility of the international order. So we see that scientific or rational measures are seen as unacceptable constraints on freedom, while othering and exclusion of certain people are seen as expressions of strength and defensible security measures. We see this in trade, public health, responses to climate change, anything that's predicated on the international law goals of collective protection and realization of human rights. But in the end, this type of move leads to a crisis within these closed borders and escalates that crisis. So the very people meant to be protected by nationalist assertions of power or nationalist assertions of sovereignty are instead the ones most exposed to danger and cut off from help beyond those borders. We've seen this recently in Texas in response to their climate crisis. The crisis really escalated within their borders. Texas had, as an expression of sovereignty, refused to join the national grid, refused to connect to the power lines of other states. When crisis hit, they were cut off from outside help, and again were forced to turn inward and sort of had an escalating situation of misery. So these examples were meant to illustrate how the current populist backlash to the liberal legal order is actually drawing more power, I think, from the contradictions inherent in the current system and threatens to spiral beyond the reach of both international law and the current global legal order. The populist claims that nationalist power would be strengthened by prioritizing domestic grievances over collective action or global needs has actually gutted national defenses and sovereign power, both within states and the international community of states. So as a result, I think we're left wondering whether today's backlash can become tomorrow's tsunami and gravely wound our current global legal order. So with that, I'll stop and move on to the next panelist, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shruti. So let me turn next to Anne-Marie Slaughter, who really is someone who needs literally no introduction to this audience as a past president of ASIL and one of America's leading international lawyers and foreign policy thought leaders. As everyone knows, Anne-Marie is currently CEO of the think tank New America, and served previously as Director of Policy Planning for the State Department, the first woman to hold that position. Prior to her service in government, she was Dean of Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. And prior to that, the J. Sinclair Armstrong Professor of International Foreign and Comparative Law at Harvard Law School. Anne-Marie has written many influential books and hundreds of articles in international law, and has just published a fascinating essay in Foreign Affairs titled Opening Up the Order, A More Inclusive International System, which I think we'll be hearing a bit about this morning. So Anne-Marie, as a longtime observer and analyst of the dynamics and shifts in international law, how do you see the current picture? And how should we explain the phenomena that we see at this moment in history?
Peter, thank you. And to everybody watching, it's great to be back at the ASIL annual meeting, even if it's virtual. And I'm particularly pleased to be on this panel. To learn from my fellow panelists, and I think to discuss something so fundamental. And so I do want to start by agreeing with Shruti that I see this as much more than a backlash. I actually see this moment as the result of many factors, but the biggest one from my perspective is that it's a long-term consequence of exclusion in the international system. And so I would start by saying, just imagine, even when I started my career in 1990, so you were closer to sort of halfway between 1945 and 2045. You say to people, let's imagine the world of 2045 being run by the victors of World War II, because that's what the UN Security Council is, with a little jiggering. That would be like saying in 1945, you're going to be run by the great powers of 1845. That can't hold. In the first place, the UN was created for 60 nations. Now you have almost 200. That was an entirely northern hemisphere centric view. I mean, all those changes meant for the liberal international order to survive in anything like what its founders intended, you had to broaden it. And I think we've missed that moment, at least for formal broadening. And that moment was right after the millennium, with Kofi Annan really doing everything he possibly could to get reform of the UN Security Council. And many of us participated, and there were alternate ways. Did you add permanent members? Did you try to broaden it? You found, as somebody who was involved in this, the minute you said, let's add India and Germany and Japan, immediately Pakistan was right there. Or indeed, if you talked about Germany, Italy was right there. And Ibrahim can talk about the tensions. If you said South Africa, then Nigeria or Egypt were there. We missed that window. And there's not much point in wondering if it could have been different. So now we have to figure out, how do you create an international order or expand it to be genuinely much more inclusive? And my argument is not only inclusive of states, but inclusive of global actors. And I very carefully say global actors and not non-state actors. And non-state is like defining an automobile as a horseless carriage. The whole point is that we are moving to a world in which we need the power, the resources, the energy of many different actors, of corporate actors, of civic actors, of philanthropists, of international and regional organizations alongside the traditional UN system. I'll take the example that Shruti gave of the pandemic paradox, which I thought was great. If I look at where equitable global distribution of the vaccine is most likely to come from, it is not the UN Security Council. There's no chance it's going to be the UN Security Council. And it's not even the World Health Organization. It's COVAX, which is a joint venture between the World Health Organization, the EU, and Gavi, the Gavi now called the Vaccine Alliance, the Global Vaccine Alliance. But what is Gavi? Gavi is something created initially by the Gates Foundation, working with the WHO, also working though with lots of big corporations, the corporations that could give you vaccines at cost, working with all the civic groups, not only global civic groups, but to deliver those vaccines, you have to be working with the civic organizations and the governments of individual countries. It is what I would call, as a network theorist, an impact hub. It's a hub of many, many different kinds of actors. You have to invest in a secretariat of that hub, just as you need to have a secretariat for global organizations. But that's where I think you can get the kind of effective government action that addresses what ultimately has to be the reason for a global order, which is that you can improve people's lives on the ground if you have this global order. And originally, the United Nations system was designed to stop war and peace, interstate aggression, and it's not been the only reason, but it has made a difference. But today, if you talk about climate change or pandemics or terrorism, many of the things that affect people's lives, health security, food security, many other kinds of crises, the UN system is not actually effective. So I will start from the idea that we have to have a wider system. It's got to be much more inclusive. I believe we're not going to get there by just including other great powers. I think you can do more with regional organizations and elevate their role. But ultimately, we have to get to a place where we're including all these other actors. Now, the huge issue, of course, is the legitimacy of those actors. I mean, even when I was talking about networks of government officials back in 2004, the response was pretty predictable, which is, well, who elected these, financial regulators or environmental regulators or even judges? There's no global legitimacy. So I would then say we have to build off the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is very imperfect, but it's done more than other agreements to tackle global climate change. And it has a whole section for non-party stakeholders. So international law is now recognizing stakeholders, but they're not parties to the agreement because they have no formal status under international law. We, as international lawyers, as foreign policymakers, have to think about what is the process of legitimating those actors. And we have some example, if you think about the PLO as a non-state observer at the UN. I mean, there are ways to do this. My time's almost up. I want to conclude by talking about how I also think this wider vision of a global order will diversify the global order. I mean, the International College, the Global College of International Lawyers, I've forgotten the exact phrase, is still very white, very male. It's much better than when I started 30 years ago. But if you look at who is making these decisions in the key rooms of power around the world, you're still seeing a huge lack of diversity within countries as well as across them. These global actors, that's very different. In the United States, for instance, if you look at mayors and governors' offices, they're much more diverse than the top of the federal government in foreign policy or international law. And then if you add civic groups and obviously corporations, not in the Northern Hemisphere, but if we look globally, you are seeing a much more diverse group of participants. Once again, though, and I'll end here, the key question is how do we legitimate them? How do we create a system that is not just soft law, that allows for a global order that can solve problems? So thanks very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So let me turn next to Jamil Daqua, who is director of the American Civil Liberty Union's Human Rights Program, where he leads a team of lawyers and advocates who conduct human rights research, documentation, and public education, and engage in litigation and advocacy before both US courts and international human rights bodies. Prior to joining the ACLU, he worked at Human Rights Watch, where he conducted research and advocacy on issues of torture and detention in Egypt, Morocco, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories. So, Jamil, as an international human rights lawyer, how do you view the current moment and the current picture? And in particular, how should we understand the almost complete abandonment of human rights in US foreign policy in particular over the last 4 years?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for organizing this very timely and important conversation. So I come to this as an international human rights lawyer who had the experience to work on international human rights in different parts of the world, but mainly really coming from the Middle East. As a Palestinian American, have in the last 15 years or 16 years have been particularly focused on the United States and the way that United States have been addressing the issues of racial inequality, lack of rights for the most marginalized, historically discriminated in the United States, with or without consideration of international human rights law. And so my experience is really mixed of both, from working outside the United States, but also working in the United States and trying to really make a shift in terms of the way that foreign policy and domestic policy should really be more closely linked rather than completely separated as it's been for many, many decades. So I would like to start by really going back to the point about the question about the rise in popular movements and rejection of the international liberal legal order, and to what extent that, how do we see that? I think one thing we need to really distinguish is between there are two kinds of, largely speaking, two kinds of forces that have been pushing back against the international liberal order. One, and they are obviously have two different objectives, two different goals, and are not the same at all. One is obviously those groups of people who are really believe in white nationalism, who believe in national sovereignty, in the way to perpetuate their access to power, their hegemony, their dominance in those societies. And we've seen that very, very powerfully even before Trump ran for president, right? The forces in the United States and in other countries as well, and I can give other examples, but particularly the fact that we have always been these forces of white nationalists in the United States. There's increasing discussion, which is very healthy now, about the white supremacy and what the impact of the U.S. democratic order, as well as its engagement with the world. On the other hand, and this is obviously sees this group of movements sees international cooperation, legal order as a threat to their dominance. And they are also very much using all kinds of conspiracy theories, including anti-Semitic tropes like the ones that are leveled against, for example, George Soros from time to time, to make the case that these are international institutions that are trying to come after us, and here are the individuals who are essentially controlling the world. On the other hand, you see a popular resistance to that is coming really from a different type of movement, a movement that is more inclusive, movement that has been excluded, maybe to connect to Anne-Marie's comments, excluded from not only from the international legal order, but excluded from the national democratic order, either by not enjoying democracy at all or by being left out of democracy in a meaningful way. And I'm obviously here not talking only about fair and free elections. We're talking about a constant participation of people in their daily life and having an influence and a meaningful influence on what happens in their life, and being able to feel that they are the country, the state is really putting their interest at the center of it, their human rights, their well-being, etc. And obviously that's a critique of not just countries that don't have any democratic values or institutions, but it would cover the United States, is the way that we have excluded marginalized communities, people who were historically discriminated, particularly Black people, brown people, and indigenous people. And here, these popular movements are fighting against racism, are fighting against corporate capitalism, if you wish, both nationally and internationally, are fighting against environmental crisis that is having direct impact and disproportionate impact on them. And if you look at the way that, for example, the Standing Rock movement against the DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline project, and that has how it resonated around the world and became really a transnational movement. It really tells you a lot about how it is not just a water crisis or indigenous sacred sites in one particular location, very remote. Very few people would even visit North Dakota at any point in their life, even if they live in the United States. And of course, a pushback against militarization and wars around the world, and forever wars, which is something that obviously after 9/11, there's much more discussion of the consequences of what that means. And so to me, the real way of dealing with it is looking at both the international order, but also linking, it has to link to fundamental changes, transformative changes at the national level, particularly in countries that have aspired or at least put itself as model for liberal democratic values and institutions. And I think the United States really should be the one to make that shift. And that is not something that will be done overnight. I think we can talk more about that. But I just wanted to throw one thing about the issue of making it more inclusive. We want to be very careful of not to turn it into further privatization type of inclusiveness. That is, let's bring more of those corporate actors that are not accountable, least accountable, or transparent. All these dealings behind closed doors, there is no real accountability. I think that's not what Anne-Marie is suggesting, but I think more importantly, we have to stress that, because that's exactly what is leading people to push back and have cynicism against international actors. How does that work? Why is it that I don't have a voice? So even within those movements, so for example, you hear from Movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter movement organizations who say, yes, we do want to engage internationally and have the United Nations be part of holding the United States accountable for racism in the United States. But at the same time, there's quite a clear understanding that how the United Nations itself has been really dominated by actors that are not interested in that shift in powers and in the power. It has in itself actually a racism problem. So I think there should be a constant and parallel change that happens in the international level, in these international institutions, while at the same time making sure that it happens at the national level. Only during that sort of both parallel and both tracks, if they are really run and go in the right direction, we will be able to see more changes. Of course, having governments that are more interested in that. And I think my time is up, so I would turn it back to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let me turn to, last but not least, our fourth speaker, Ambassador Ebrahim Rasul, who's joining us from Cape Town in South Africa. Ebrahim is a politician and diplomat who served as South Africa's ambassador to the United States from 2010 to 2015, as a member of the South African National Assembly and as the 5th Premier of the Western Cape. He's a member of the African National Congress and has held various leadership positions in the party. More recently, he's been a distinguished scholar in residence at Georgetown University's Walsh School for Foreign Service, where he worked in the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, advancing an alternative paradigm to the inertia of orthodoxies in the face of extremisms. So Ebrahim, welcome, and viewed from a Southern African perspective, I guess, how do you view the current moment, the current backlash that we're seeing, and this apparent rejection of multilateral international legal institutions?
Thank you very much, Peter. And from my terms, good evening to all my fellow panelists. I want to just make 5, hopefully simple points in response to the issues that you raise. And I speak from a kind of South perspective, from a kind of third world in the old parlance. I want to say that even here we recognize the centrality of the United States to the shaping of a global order. Even those who are have the most antipathy towards the United States have come to recognize the consequence of the United States, particularly over the last 4 years under Trump, and was even beginning to involve themselves in an election for an alternative to Trump, just so that the world could breathe a sigh of relief. So the United States is consequential, and therefore it's important that we get it right. I think the United States, since World War II, presided over a world that was essentially in equilibrium. I think after the Berlin Wall, it became a unipolar power. I think over the last 30 years, we have seen the seeds of decline in US power and hegemony and influence over the world. And so in a sense, I think that that's the first point that I want to make, that we need to understand whether this is a moment to return to business as usual, or whether this is a moment of rupture that could lead to something completely different. So that's the first point that I want to make. The second point that I want to make is that the US, even in the last 30 years, are in decline because they have not addressed, as Anne-Marie so eloquently said, the structural fault lines in the international system. The most fundamental one, and I think we often are inelegant in our language, we interchange international order with global order. I believe the two are fundamentally different. World War II gave us an international order in which each state could revel in its own sovereignty, and you had to negotiate the sovereignty of the one against the other, and nothing prepared us for global crises. And COVID-19 has emerged as one crisis that demands global governance and where international governance is not sufficient. Climate change, the same thing, the economic ravages across the world, the terrorism and extremism ravages across the world show that they resist international governance and they require global governance. So I think we have to have a paradigm shift in relation to that. And the United States has to take some responsibility for not creating that inclusiveness, reforming, for example, the United Nations Security Council. It was unable to harmonize contradictions, 9/11 at home and a war on terror abroad, and reaping the wind as we go on. It didn't. The United States should have led the way, for example, with a values-driven agenda. Instead, it came with an interest-driven agenda and blinked when the last resistant part of the world, the Middle East, for example, was poised for democracy, for human rights, and for freedom. The United States blinked and authoritarianism returned. That's the second point that I want to make, the missed opportunities in reforming from international governance to global governance. I've said part of the third one. I think we are dealing up till now with three intersecting crises: the economic crisis of particularly 2008, the climate crisis, the Paris Agreement being absolutely crucial, the human crisis, which is often understated. We don't know what to do with the other. We love the mobility of capital, we love the mobility of goods, we love the mobility of technology, but we don't know what to do with the mobility of people. And that's created a human crisis, and we are not prepared for that because we don't have a regime that governs refugees, that governs displaced people, that governs the movement of people, and that has created its own crisis. And that brings me to the fourth area that I want to speak about, is that we are not just dealing with national isolation. We are dealing with ethnic isolationism, with sectarian isolationism, with factional isolationism, in which the most powerful grouping within countries are able to seize power, as we have seen, particularly in the United States, but as is becoming really perverse all over the world. The mobilization of grievance as a way in which to set domestic policy and to retreat from the international one. So the fifth point that I want to make is that the USA has not only been distracted, but it's been in retreat. It's not only been in retreat, but has in effect, particularly over the last 4 years, given succor to malignancy in the global order. It has been able to give a green light to authoritarianism, to populism. It has tolerated illiberal democracies. It has given the kind of steroids to extremism and to those kind of informal, malignant forces. And most importantly, I think that what is going to drive this, and this is the last point that I will make, what is going to drive this is in effect the rise of impunity, where there should be a rule of law globally and within countries. We instead have impunity. The decline of democracy, we have more elections, but less democracy, less inclusion. Because illiberal forces, authoritarians, have mastered the art of either manipulating elections or manipulating the grievances of people. We have the rise of bigotries, whether it is on orientation, whether it is on ethnicity, on race, on language, or whatever the case may be. That's what we have. And more importantly, germane to the system we have is corruption. Whether it is corruption within countries, as we're going through in South Africa, or corruption globally, even with a veneer of respectability by private sector actors as well. And so I think that this global order is in rupture at this moment. Whether we move to a new reality is what discussions like this must give definition to. I think we have run out of time. If we don't take hold of this crisis, it may pass us by, as Anne-Marie said, the Kofi Annan movement passed us by a decade ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for these really fascinating presentations. So what I'd like to do now with our remaining time is to go to a second round of conversation and ask you perhaps to offer an example or a current domain of contestation that you've looked at in your work that can illustrate some of these themes and amplify some of the arguments that you're advancing. Anne-Marie, in your recent article in Foreign Affairs, you talk about widening the liberal order, not out but down. And this means including a whole host, as you say, of global actors. And you mentioned in particular the Paris Agreement, perhaps as a good site for this argument. Maybe you could tell us more about how you see this playing out and what you would offer on that point.
So first of all, I've been taking notes actively. Those were wonderful presentations. Ibrahim, I have to say, given succor to malignancy in the global order, any American should agree in many ways. And so I will just comment on that. So the Paris Agreement it really does capture what Ibrahim said, and I deeply agree, is this possibility of a paradigm shift from the international order, those are the states parties, right, to the global order, who are the non-state parties. And, the non-state parties, as I said, the fact that they're not parties means they have no formal recognition under that 20th century system of international law. And we have got to get to a point where they do have recognition. I was thinking as I was listening, I remembered the full quote. It's the invisible College of International Lawyers. And
Oscar Schachter, right?
Oscar Schachter. But to Jamil's point, it can't be invisible. Invisible means illegitimate. So our question then is, how do you move to that system of global governance and I agree that has to be global impunity, which actually means much more individual enforcement of international law against corruption, against war crimes or crimes against humanity. So there are lots of things that have to change there, but the transparency has to go with it. Transparency and some legitimacy of either outcome or input or both. And let me give you the one example of contestation. So I think this is going on in climate very strongly, but the other is democracy promotion. So if you notice, candidate Biden writes something in Foreign Affairs where he talks about restoring the free world, which to my kids means a rock group, not, they don't have any notion of what we thought of it. But he says, I'm going to call a summit for democracies. And one of his our Secretary of State talked about a League of Democracies. That is exactly the kind of expansion out that I think is a real problem. In the first place, the United States is going to start picking democracies at the moment? I don't think so. Far better for us to recognize the deep problems we're grappling with democracy and make common cause with the people around the world who are struggling for the rule of law, for the separate, curbs on checks on power, for the minority rights, all the elements of democracy. To do that, it's not a summit of democracies. It is now what the Biden administration is calling a summit for democracy, but we'll see if they can really get beyond the status model.
Fantastic, thank you. So following Anne-Marie's comments, Ebrahim, if I can come back to you, what do you see as the impact of these intersecting crises that you discuss on states and global actors, particularly in Africa and the Middle East? And is this rupture a moment where there is a possibility for reconfiguration, realignment, even reimagination of the existing arrangements? I think you're on mute there.
I think, Peter, that if a summit of the kind that Anne-Marie speaks about for democracy does emerge in response to these intersecting crises, I think rather than have a prescription for we want you to do democracy like this, and we want you to adopt markets like this, which was the kind of previous promoting democracy paradigms, I think we should actually come together as Democrats, progressive people, whatever the case may be, to solve a triangular conundrum that will particularly be of importance to the worlds in which I come from, the African area, the Asian area, the MENA region, etc., where we have had this bypass of good democratic accountability for interest-based reasons. The triangular conundrum in my book says, if you can solve three angles of the triangle, how do we fundamentally bring relief to the restless, the streets, who are poverty-stricken, on the wrong end of inequality, have no say and inclusion in their lives? That's the first angle. The second angle is, how do we manage, in my more militant days, I would have said eliminate. How do you manage the unsustainable, the monarchies, the dictatorships, the authoritarian regimes? How do you manage them eventually out of power? And thirdly, how do you do those two and continue to prevent the undesirable, the extremists, from filling the vacuum? That is absolutely crucial. I've been obliquely involved in some of the background work in Doha between the Afghan government and the Taliban, trying to think Islamically about states beyond the binaries of Darul Islam and the hostile state, but in between, finding that world. And this triangle, this triangular conundrum, is for me the key to how we should exercise our minds. We should be focused on outcomes and not only on form. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Jamil, coming back to you, for over 20 years, you've been working in the space of US engagement with human rights law and institutions. I wonder if you could offer us some thoughts about spaces of contestation at the moment in the human rights field, and what conclusions or insights you could offer us on these issues.
Thank you. I think that first I would just want to say that in addition to the Paris Agreement, I think one other model that could be helpful to Anne-Marie's comments is the Global Compact for Migration, in the way that it tried to address issues of migration, mobility of people, refugees. And I think there's a great potential there that should be looked at as a model for how to bring different stakeholders. And you can see there the human rights experts and mechanisms were tried really hard to center human rights of people, of migrants and refugees. So I would offer that. But also I want to just a little bit more a pushback maybe on the Ambassador's Rasul and like the significance of the United States role because the United States has been historically part of the problem, not always part of the solution. And I know that you probably agree with me, but I think your comments, the way that I hear them, is that as if the key for change, U.S. obviously in the last 4 years was reprehensible in the way that under Trump, but that was not only a Trump problem. I think we have had a much longer problem of the way that we have engaged internationally based on our self-interest. And now that is exactly what governments do, right? You engage internationally based on how do you achieve and you promote your own self-interest as a country. But the problem with that approach with the United States was premised on the foundations that are already excluding so many people in the United States and taking role in that vision of the world. Particularly around issues of economic equality and justice, around racial equality, as you know, the history of the way the US pushed back against participation in international human rights system, fearing that this will come back to the southern states, from the Bricker Amendment, for those who are familiar with this, the way that we have, for decades, did not ratify treaties for human rights. And when we ratified them, we rendered them meaningless, particularly domestically, in impacting domestic policy. So my experience has been in the last 15, 20 years, is that if we don't do that shift in the way that the United States takes its responsibilities internationally, both at the international level, but more importantly at the domestic level, we will not be able to change that shift. And obviously that will happen only when we will start to look at transformational change, which is slightly moving in the right direction. The racial equity executive order, the way that the Biden administration started to talk about these things in terms of policy and reviewing the federal government operations, is in the right direction. That is coming from the movements that are holding this particular administration accountable. These are the people, the Black women who voted for this administration. And they demanded inclusion, both on gender justice, racial justice, and equity, and particularly in the distribution of wealth and resources. So I think that one thing we have to learn is consistency and principled engagement, which was lacking. We've seen in the last few days how the United States have, on one hand, addressed Russia in very firm words related to rejecting annexation, rejecting the way that it's acted in Crimea, while just a couple of days later reacted in a very, very dangerous way towards the ICC decision with regard to the Palestine situation. That is exactly the kind of thing that has to be shifted in terms of the way that the United States' role to become more credible actor internationally that is rooted in fairness and equality. And I think moving into that direction requires intensive and not just what I would say interest convergence. Just to take the theory of the late Professor Derek Bell, who looked at the way that the United States made changes to racial equality based on when the Black and white interest converged. And this is when we saw advancements domestically. I don't want to see that same way, which has happened internationally, when the United States, this kind of interest convergence, only when the United States interests are only allowing, or particularly for those who are benefiting from a new global order, will then do the right thing. I think there has to be more fundamental fairness and consistency and principled engagement in order to change things so that people will feel included. People will have to see that the international system is indeed working effectively to hold their governments accountable when domestic operations fail, particularly when there's no democracy and authoritarianism, etc. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. And following Jamil's comments in the human rights space, Trudy, in your work, you have studied for many years the transnational space around CEDAW and the ways in which different groups, civil society groups, come to occupy contested spaces around that convention and treaty bodies. Could you offer us some thoughts from your work on both the possibilities and dangers in this area?
Sure. And actually, I think if we hone in on this example, I think it's a really good example of what Anne-Marie was saying of impact hubs and networks and how they work, but also what Ibrahim and Jamil are pointing out about without structural change, we go back to a crisis of legitimacy. So just to, provide a little window on what's going on. What's really interesting about the space around the International Women's Convention, or CEDAW, is that this is an area where the populist leaders and movements who are disengaging from transnational other, treaty bodies and institutions are really heavily re-engaging in this women's space. And I think there's some really interesting reasons why that really illustrate some of the things our other panelists have discussed. So one reason for this is that if we think about the global patterns of populism, they're really predicated on these highly gendered views of who the people are that excludes women, right? Their voices are not to be amplified, but instead women are referred back to their roles as mothers or reproducers of the nation. So this is their incentive for re-engaging in that space. What makes it possible for them to engage is that, the space around the Women's Convention is a space where national sovereignty doesn't matter as much. The groups who are there are really fighting against their own governments often. And we know that most countries don't really take that convention very seriously. They don't view it as binding, and it's riddled with loopholes. So in consequence, and because the women who are affected are usually excluded from global elites, the Women's Convention created a participatory space that heavily relied on civil society participation and empowered individual women and organizations, particularly after the Beijing conference in the mid-1990s. What happened, unfortunately, is that this space is really being hijacked by these illiberal forces, these sort of anti-women, anti-human rights forces. And they were really able to come into these civil society spaces because they're linked to these incredibly powerful pre-existing movements, that really show that those pre-existing hierarchies were never dismantled. So just as some quick examples, we see that in these civil society spaces, again, that are meant to empower grassroots organizations, individual women, the most powerful groups now are the Vatican and the alliances that it's making with right-wing groups, basically to turn the clock back on reproductive rights, on protections against domestic violence and things like that. And what I think it shows some really interesting things, right? So one is this puzzle of nationalism. I think it shows that this movement that's focused on domestic grievances is actually a transnational movement that crosses borders. It's just that it mobilizes around illiberal and anti-modern views of families and, using illiberal and authoritarian measures to accomplish its goals. The second thing I think it really shows is how easily networked decentralized spaces for non-state actors can be hijacked by groups that have a particular range of power. And it raises the question of how do we legitimize these groups, right? These spaces, how do we guarantee a liberal orientation where illiberal actors have the ability to amass power and leverage, and in fact have more power and leverage than the groups that were meant to be empowered? So I think we really need to look closely at what's going on in this space and think about how what measures, state actors and non-state actors can take to counter these pushes, before the clock has actually been irrevocably turned back, I think, in these areas.
Thank you, Shruti. So our time is virtually up, but just as a last word, I did want to take the opportunity to ask Anne-Marie. We have a new administration, the Biden administration, and I wonder if you could just offer some concluding thoughts on what possibilities or openings you see for either realignment or reimagination at this moment. Oops, I think you're on mute there, Anne-Marie.
I see many opportunities for realignment and probably fewer for reconceptualization. On realignment, I do think that this is a government that understands that the United States can't just return to the global stage. It needs to re-engage as a new leader, as a leader that needs to listen, that needs to understand the ways in which the world has moved on. And Ibrahim actually, I think, laid some of those out, but also the ways in which we can play a far more productive role. I think, again, not leading from the front, I'd say leading more from the center, and the sort of idea of impact hubs, and never leading alone. There, you're going to see allies first, right? This administration is going to try to reach out to others before it does anything. Where it is less likely to really tackle the deep ties between domestic and global that we've been talking about. I mean, a real connection between foreign and domestic policy, which this administration talks about a great deal, is to understand the ways in which our international policies are at variance, strongly at variance often with our domestic policies. I mean, when I suggested in a tweet that we should actually think about what foreign policy looked like with racial equity at the center, not just racial equity to the water's edge, and then we do what we normally do globally, the pushback was just virulent. And yet, ultimately, I think that is right? That it has to be transnational, that we have to think about, wait a minute, if we're committed to racial equity, what is the impact of our foreign policy, not only on racial groups at home, but globally? Because those racial groups in the United States are now connected to populations around the world. They're going to see those populations the same way white Americans have thought about European Americans. That's a much bigger shift. I don't think this administration is ready for that. But on the other hand, in the next 4 years, they have a very full plate. So I hope places like ASIL and those of us who are scholars and activists and people trying to change makers can try to do some of this bigger thinking because it's going to be a decades long change.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to each of you for these insights and for being able to join us this morning for this fascinating conversation. We will be engaging again with participants at the conference in a couple of weeks using the continuing the conversation function on Zoom. And so I look forward to seeing you again at that time. But thank you to each of you.
Thank you.